Today, and Rob has a case in Canada that some of you may or may not be aware of. Basically, Rob's daughter was allowed by the state to start using puberty blockers and testosterone at the age of 14 without his consent, and he fought to prevent this from happening. But Canada has something called the Infants Act, which allows doctors to empower children to take charge of their own medical care, and so Rob fought that in court, and as part of his hearing, he was actually given a gag order and was told he wasn't allowed to talk about this case. In fact, he has been talking about this case, and he's going to talk about it more today. And what we're here to talk to you about with Rob today is recently you had a hearing about the criminal charges that you've now been under for breaking that gag order. So instead of having civil charges of contempt, you are facing criminal charges. And I was just wondering if you could fill us in on the most recent hearing and where things stand now.
Yeah, thanks for having me. If I go back to March, I'm just going to quickly touch on this because it really explains where I was at September 2, why I was there. Is my daughter, who is AB in this case, had told her lawyer, Barbara Finley, that she did not want to pursue civil contempt of court charges. And in fact, I say this because it came up again for clarification on September 2, which I'll get into. But that's very important because what happened then is that Barbara Finley and some of these other lawyers pretty much implored Justice Tamman, who was a judge again on September 2, to find another way to pursue criminal contempt of court charges. And that's exactly what he did. He handed this over to the government of British Columbia and the Attorney General, who was in the courtroom. Who immediately seemed pretty happy to take this on and were quite happy to accept.
So just for clarification, in a typical case like this, it would be the injured party who would pursue the civil contempt charges. But in this case, your daughter did not want those charges pursued. So the courts decided to pursue criminal charges against you instead. Is that correct?
That is correct. And what makes this a one-of-a-kind case pretty much in Canada that's ever turned out this way is that never before has a case gone from either a civil case, which this was, and a family case, which this also was. There were two concurrently running files, which Herb Dunton and I filed the civil matter, which was the CD versus everybody, the school boards, the health, public health, governments, school counselors, psychologists, doctors, hospitals, and then Barbara Finley, meanwhile, went and filed in family court, which is the one that is more commonly known, which is the AB versus CDEF file. But neither were criminal files. And so this is the first in Canada where they have essentially said, well, we're just going to step in on this. We're going to say, okay, well, if the daughter's not pursuing civil criminal contempt civil contempt of court charges, we're just going to step in and do that ourselves. So they've turned a family file into a criminal file. It's never happened in the history of Canada. So it's a first, and I'm going to explain some of the stuff with September 2, which I can get into now then. So on September 2, that's the Attorney General and the government of BC did end up proceeding and filing these criminal contempt of court charges against me. So I had my initial hearing on September 2, which was a couple Wednesdays ago now. And what happened there is it was actually a bit of a mix-up at the beginning, and I think in your interview with Kerry Lynn, he even kind of made mention of some of that. But truthfully, I think it kind of worked out well, and I'll explain why. Because I walked in, and I happened to be early, so I was there at 9 a.m. when we were supposed to be in court. But typically in a civil and family court matter, the doors open at 9, but the judge doesn't arrive until 10 into chambers. Because this is criminal, it's different. He was there, it started at 9 sharp. And I was fortunate because I was there early. And so I initially represented myself, and simply what I did is I just had them delay the start of the hearing until 9:30. And hopefully trying to get a hold of Kerry Lynn to get in there because obviously for a couple of reasons. One, he's the lawyer. And number two, if I'm representing myself, there's going to be stuff that he misses, right? That he's not aware of. And in fact, there are some things that did happen because when we adjourned at 9:30, there was about another 10 minutes where the Attorney General lawyer and the judge were actually making some rulings and doing some different things without Carrie-Lynn being there. They weren't overly significant. They don't affect much, but it was happening. So I was glad when he showed up, because obviously you don't want him to miss out on any of that information that's taking place in that exchange of information.
And one of the important things that Carrie talked about that I just want to ask you about is he said that they put you in a prisoner's box, which is where they put people who are charged with serious crimes. They put them there during the hearings. And I was just wondering if you could describe that and how you felt about it.
Right. Yeah. When I got there, I mean, the first question that was given to me is, do you have a face mask? As I'm walking in, the sheriffs were asking this question, and I said, I don't. But I said, if that's your policy, I've got one in the car. It's going to take me a few minutes. I've got to run out and we can go get it. And then they explained that they had some at the other side of the courthouse. And then eventually another sheriff came up and said, there's no rules in Canada or in BC that say you have to wear a face mask. And so the other sheriff kind of said, okay, fine. Yeah, you're right. We can't make you wear a face mask anyways. And then they, in fact, dropped the whole face mask thing and never asked even anybody else coming in to put one on. So, but as that conversation was going on, the lawyer for the government saw me, and of course he watched videos. I mean, we can talk about how he nicely had the police department transcribe our last interview, so you have a free transcript apparently. But obviously he knows
of the previous interview that you and I did.
Yes, that's yeah. And I can get into that too because that's part of their evidence now. But anyway, so he recognizes me. I mean, he's watched videos, and he right away turns and he's kind of pointing, and he's like, as if somebody had walked in with a gun, and it was like, that's the accused. That's the accused. He goes in the prisoner's docket right here. He doesn't get to sit in the gallery.
Wow.
I walked out of the courtroom at that point because I was a bit early, and so I had no reason to be already in the prisoner's docket. But of course, when I came back in, when the judge came in the first time, that's where I sat. But then, of course, Carrie-Lynn wasn't there. And then when we reconvened at 9:30, that's again where I was sitting. And of course, Carrie-Lynn does walk in about 10 minutes later, and he's confused because he's looking in the gallery and he doesn't see me there. And then he noticed that I'm in this prisoner docket, and he doesn't even introduce himself to the judge or anything. He just comes in swinging, and he's like, "What's my client doing in the prisoner's docket? He's not the accused. He's not a prisoner. He's not any of these things." And I could tell that to some degree, I think both that lawyer and the judge were a bit taken aback. And honestly, it wasn't the judge that put me there. It was the suggestion of this other lawyer, and the sheriff just followed along. And he ended up eventually owning that. And after a bit of drama, I did eventually end up in a separate chair right beside the prisoner's docket. So,
how did that feel?
To me, maybe I didn't at the time realize the significance of it like Carrie did when he walked in. Like, honestly, I've never been in a criminal trial before. So I thought, wow, I've got a front row seat, a nice big wide bench. It didn't actually bother me too much.
You didn't understand the significance of it.
I did not, I guess, right? And the optics of it. And obviously Carrie walked in and saw that right away. And so obviously in reflection, I realized what he did was pretty significant in getting me out of that prisoner's docket. And Carrie also made it very clear that, the Crown Counsel on the other side and the judge himself, don't have the right to call me the accused. I'm not accused. I'm a parent who just happened to be talking truth. And they seem to understand that, according to Carrie, that they're going to try not to call me the accused anymore.
And so there are 3 charges of criminal contempt against you at this point?
3 that have been filed, and one of them involves my interview with yourself. And truthfully, I'm not even sure what the other 2 are at this point. I would imagine that there are a couple of different other interviews. I haven't even gone through all of the paperwork, to be honest. There's so much stuff that I get and deal with.
And it's kind of ironic because when we did the interview, we both knew that you were violating the gag order, but I don't think that I really thought that you would be charged with criminal contempt just for talking to me about your situation. And to me, it's shocking that Canada is pursuing charges against you when, you know, there's serious crime going on out there.
Right. There's people that belong probably in that prisoner's docket, and this is a priority for them. But you know, when you look at the bigger picture, you have to understand, you know, what this agenda means to these people. And I'll say to people, you know, for example, we have Barbara Finley, who's supposedly representing my daughter, yet completely ignores her client when it doesn't suit the agenda. Now, what people need to realize is my daughter is a pseudo client. She is just there by an inconvenience for herself, because I pursued ways of stopping this nonsense of sterilizing children and child abuse that was taking place. But the real client is the agenda. And so when you look at it through that lens, you'll see exactly what they did made sense, because it's not about my daughter. They need to pursue criminal contempt charges because that's what the agenda demands, right? Not
They
my
need
daughter.
to keep you quiet. They need to keep you quiet, because if people start hearing that they're sterilizing children without parents, sometimes even knowledge, let alone consent, people are going to be in an uproar.
Right, because in a normal civil or family case, if whoever you're against, whether it's a wife or ex-wife or rarely a child, but this is another rare one, where there's a child who's you know, involved this directly in something, it gets dropped, right? That's how civil court and family court works. If my ex says, fine, I'm going to concede you can have 70% of the parenting time, then the judge goes, okay, well then, and that's what the father wants, then that's what we're going to go with. They don't bring in the attorney general and say, well, wait, no, ex-wife, you can't do that. 70%. Are you crazy? We're going to step in, turn this criminal, because that man does not deserve 70%. It doesn't happen, but here it is. Exactly is what happened.
And I
Right?
can't imagine, I mean, if your daughter does not want them to pursue charges against you, and yet they are, I can't imagine how that makes your daughter feel. I mean, we can't presume to know, but if they're trying to look out for the interest of your daughter, throwing her dad in jail is definitely not in her best interest.
No, and this is something I have said, is that, you know, the courts, especially in family court, and I'd imagine it's pretty universal across Canada, the US, Europe, is they always try and tell you, and I don't deny that this is true, is that they're trying to come up with what is in the best interest of the child, especially when two parents are disputing something. You know, what works for the child? Is it having, for example, 50-50 parenting? If that's what they were doing during the separation, a judge is likely going to continue that because that's what the child is used to, for example. And so they're always trying to define that line where the child comes first in terms of the dispute. You know, and in this case, that was clearly not at all what went on here. If they were trying to do it was in the best interest of the child, I wouldn't have been in a prisoner docket on September 2.
No.
And again, that's why I say this is not about what's in the best interest of my child. This is about what's in the best interest in their minds of the agenda. And that's why parents and other, not just parents, I mean, this is a big war on parental rights, but I mean, just the general silent majority of that population has to realize that anyone who stands in the way of this agenda is standing in the way of this massive bulldozer that is going to come in and try and just destroy them at all costs. And we have to say that's not going to happen. And we have to fight back at all costs, right? And I think that's what is taking place. I see pushback for the first time. That has been something that I noticed when I came into this early, is that so many people, maybe with good intentions, I would imagine, I'm not going to judge their intentions, but we're simply content to push back, hold the fort, and slow down the losses as best as they could. But you're not winning anything. You're not saving children by doing that. We had to go on the offense, and that's what's happened here. And I think we're getting first downs finally, and we've got them starting to wonder, well, how do we save this? And you can see that they are doing some pretty wild things right now in order to protect their baby, that agenda, because they know it's actually, for the first time, it's under threat. Because I'm talking, and other people as well. I mean, Jeff Younger, he broke his gag silence order as well to raise awareness on this. that people are becoming educated on this, and they are horrified and they are terrified of what's going on. And what's interesting about this case, and this is something I want to get into a little bit as well, and I've mentioned this about what happened, and now we're actually going to predate this entire trial, or this entire whole court process, I should say, not so much trial. It's preceding my very first court hearing in front of a Justice Bowden back in February of 2019. The Chief Justice of the BC Supreme Court had what they called seized himself to this case. It's never supposed to be done this way. It's supposed to work whereas a lawyer and a client, and lawyers on the other side, for example, walk into a courtroom for the first time. They do not know who the judge is going to be. Likewise, that file that this judge is going to hear is sitting on his chamber's desk, and he hasn't seen it until that morning for the very first time. And that's supposed to sort of create this sense of the fact that this is going to be a fair hearing. Everybody's coming into this fresh, brand new. But that's not what happened. The Chief Justice seized himself and therefore was essentially handpicking every judge I face in the BC Supreme Court. Moreover, if you're a BC Supreme Court Justice, who is your oversight? Who are you accountable to? Well, it's that Chief Justice. Well, that's taken away as well, because if you have a judge that does a crazy ruling, the Chief Justice can say, hey, I got to control my judges in my courtroom. We're being made to look very stupid here, you know? But when you're given a mandate to do whatever you want, it's no wonder I was getting these absolute asinine rulings against me, because these judges essentially were given a mandate to do that. They had no fear of repercussions from a Chief Justice at this point.
Do you know if they were given access to the files prior to the hearings?
Well, and this is the one thing that happened before Carrie Lynn showed up in those 10 minutes. And I was actually going to get into it, but we sort of got talking about the prisoner's docket. Is the application that was made by the Attorney General was that he has no access to any of the files. He was complaining to the judge. He goes, they're all secret files. He goes, how am I supposed to run a criminal case if I can't even see what's in all those boxes? And the judge, which is Justice Tamman, actually kind of looked at him and said, he goes, it's crazy. Because he goes, I'm a judge. And he goes, I don't have access to the files in those boxes. He goes, I don't know what's in there. He goes, I'm relying on you lawyers as you file applications currently to pass them forward to me, because the minute they end up in that file, he goes, I can't access them. So he goes, I physically need you guys to hand me your copies over as you file them before they get put into this. And what's interesting about this very secret file is there's a story to it. See, I'm one of the few people that know how this thing got sealed this way, because everybody else is confused about it. And I almost stood up to straighten it out. And I thought, well, let's just let them have some fun.
And just to clarify, these are the files that relate to the case where you were trying to prevent your daughter from receiving testosterone and puberty blockers. Is that correct?
It's the whole file from the beginning to the present. Everything that's in there all ended up in one box, whether it was the civil file number or the family one, which is actually what this is still under, or even the Court of Appeal, which has its own file number, all in this box. And you're not allowed to look at it, not allowed to open it. The clerks aren't even allowed to go grab it. It's buried in a vault in the back of the registry, pretty much. And I remember, because I tried to file an application back in February of this year when I was working on the parenting part of it. And of course, I was trying to file an application under that family file. And I was told too that, no, even though you're the main person in this entire case, I didn't have access to any of the files either. So I can't even look at my own files about a case that I know what's in the files anyways, but I just want to be able to review them for certain things. And in fact, it wasn't even so much a matter of me having to review the files. It was a matter of I had a hard time filing within my own file because I'm CD. And if you swear an affidavit, you have to swear it with your given name. Well, my given name is not CD. So it took them about 2 or 3 hours. And finally, I just swore an affidavit under my own name and just said, in the file, I go by CD, but I'm going to use my own name because it's the only way I can get the affidavit even into the file. So, And they almost wouldn't let me do that because they said, well, if you use your real name, then you're outing who CD is. And I'm like, well, then it's impossible. How do I even work with my own file? They said, we don't know. It's that crazy. But what I do know about the sealed file is what originally happened with Bowden is that they did what was called a publication ban. And only certain people were going to continue to have access to the file in its entirety, because they were worried that the media was going to be able to get their hands on all these files. And so the National Post, our national newspaper, was actually in on that application, and they were the only news organization that actually had access to those files. Because I remember the CBC, for example, had even contacted the judge, and they weren't allowed access. But what other news medias could do is they could make an application, and then the judge could grant them access to the files. That was the initial sealing, if you want to call it that. But that isn't completely uncommon, and that doesn't explain what happened. Now, I was down at the clerk's, like I said, when I was trying to get access to my own files, and what he told me, he goes, truthfully, he goes, there is no sealing order on this file made by a judge. He goes, there is not one in this entire, in any of these boxes. So I said, then why do I not have access? He goes, because there's something going on here that we've never seen before. A third party has sealed all this stuff up. It wasn't even the courts. It was sealed by a higher authority. Yeah.
That's really creepy.
Yep.
Do you know who the higher person is? Who this?
Nobody has seen this before.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I felt like standing up and saying and explaining to the judge, yeah, there is no sealing order. There is just something very out of the ordinary going on here with this entire case. That's how political it is. So it's crazy. So anyway, so I guess that brings us back to that court date. And of course, after that, yes, Carrie walked in, we dealt with the prisoner's docket. And then we were just kind of clarifying a few things. And one of the things I did get, and this is what I said I would get back to you, was this whole thing on the fact that my daughter did not want to pursue civil contempt charges. And the judge initially started saying that that sort of was implying that my daughter had given the green light to Barbara Finley to pursue the criminal. And of course, Carrie Lynn jumped up and said, no, we were all there. No, this is exactly how it went down, and we have the transcripts to prove it. And so the judge did correct himself and explain the story as I have explained it already to you, that my daughter did not want it, and that it was actually his idea to follow the direction of Barbara Finley and friends to hand this over to the government. So that correction, he did make it. And in fact, he has ordered transcripts of all those 4 days in court that date back to February and March of this year, so that both Carrie Lynn and the Attorney General have access to everything that was said, so that the record is clear. And of course, that will include everything that happened with Jen Smith as well as with Laura-Lynn, because they're all part of those 4 days of hearings, which is really good news. And because these transcripts aren't cheap. And so when the judge orders them up for everybody, I mean, that obviously saves us thousands of dollars as well in costs. So.
And those are not under the seal, under this, strange seal mandate that the other materials for the hearings are part of?
That's a really good question, because I wish him luck in getting those things transcribed, to be honest. Like, I'm curious too, if he's actually, I mean, he can rule on it, but is it going to happen?
Right.
Well, we're going to find that out, because they haven't been able to get anything out of those boxes. So yeah, good question. Yet to be seen. I haven't heard that they've been transcribed yet. Normally it takes time. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if they actually can do it. So yeah, put a wager on it. You might be rich. If you pick the right side. I'd say it's a toss-up, to be honest, in this case.
Boy, at this point, anything goes. I mean, I just feel like it's so hard to predict what might happen next.
I never know what to expect anymore, because nothing goes by the playbook that you would expect in court here. So yeah, I always say grab your popcorn. I mean, you never know what's next. I mean, this is like a horror thriller. I mean, you never know what's creeping around the next corner, right?
Yeah, and I'm laughing about it, but really it's shocking, and it's horrible that here you are, a dad who just wants to speak out to protect children, and you're, last I heard, somebody mentioned up to 5 years in jail. Can you kind of talk about what your potential penalty could be for these contempt charges?
Yeah, I do want to get into that. I'll just finish off with what happened in court real quick, just so that it kind of flows there. And we kind of ended the day by setting up a tentative court date for November 30. Our action was, we are asking Judge Hammond to recuse himself, which will be the third of 4 BC Supreme Court judges I've been in front of that we have done this with. And most lawyers never ask one judge in their entire career to recuse themselves. I've asked 3 of 4 BC Supreme Court judges to do so in the last year. And of course, I had 3 judges in the BC Court of Appeal. We didn't ask them to recuse themselves, but actually they were pretty honorable people. I've never, in an interview or publicly or even privately, really come down on them, because I thought, even though I didn't like what they did and I thought they could have done more with it, I've never felt that they were connected to some of the crazy that's going on with the BC Supreme Court. So again, and of course, knowing what we know now about the Chief Justice and the way he's been manipulating judges and picking them, and truthfully, I don't even know if these judges know that they are being selected, but I can't imagine that they don't. Of course,
And
I
so based on what you've said, if this judge is recused, what's going to prevent the Chief Justice from selecting another judge that's going to rule the way he wants them to?
absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the advantage that we see in this is that, number one, because these files are really hard to look at because they're all sealed, at least we'll have a judge that wasn't there those other 4 days listening to Barbara Finley and all those other lawyers going on and on and on for 4 days, right? So they'll walk into it with strictly just knowing what's happening currently, which is the criminal application, the criminal charges, as opposed to having all that other wealth of I wouldn't call it information necessarily, but the arguments that came up in those 4 days, he will not have had access.
Really the pushing of the ideology in an attempt to really demonize you, I'm guessing.
Right. So that's obviously fresh in Justice Hammond's, well, fresh. I mean, as fresh as it can be, but he was there. So that's going to influence him. Plus, he was influenced enough to invite the government into the case. I mean, to me, that's a conflict of interest if you're going to preside over it, because you invited the criminal charges. So who we get next, is it going to be much better? I don't know, marginally, perhaps. But we felt it was something on principle, at the very least, we had to do.
And so the hearing for that is, you said November 30th?
Yeah.
Okay, and so at that point, you'll find out whether or not there has been a recusal. And if there has been, then they'll reschedule your contempt hearing. And if there hasn't been, will they just move forward quickly with your contempt hearing?
Okay, so what's happening on November 30 is there's not going to be a ruling made on the recusal. That's when it's going to be heard.
Okay.
So that's when we're going to be putting our arguments together of why Justice Hammond should recuse himself. So it's going to take a full day. And then the Crown, because typically the lawyer on the other side defends the fact that the judge should remain. I mean, that's the understanding. That's their job to do. Unless they also agree to the recusal. I don't know that happens very often, but I haven't seen it yet in the ones that we've done. But they're able to argue why the judge should stay on. And then at the end of that day, the judge can make a decision as quickly as he wants, or he can postpone that decision on the recusal for a week, 2 weeks. It's kind of up to him.
Now, who hears the recusal case? Is it Tenement?
It's the judge that you're trying to have recuse himself. That's why we're 0 for 2 so far.
Yeah.
Hinkson refused, and so did Mazzari. But of course, they were hearing their own recusal. I mean, the chances are they're not going to step down too quickly. So chances are we'll be 0 for 3. But yeah, you never know, right? I mean, and again, let's push things over till November 30, and we haven't even gotten to a trial date yet. What I am aware of is that Crown is asking for about at least 4 days, full days for the trial. I have a feeling it may even go longer.
For your contempt charges?
It's going to be about a 4 or 5 day trial.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the understanding right now, which is yet to be scheduled because we first have to get through the recusal application. And of course, and I believe Laura-Lynn explained this, and he can explain some of the stuff even better than I can in terms of the charter challenge that we're going to be doing, because obviously my freedom of speech has been so obliterated and so destroyed, and just so violated against, that we feel that there's plenty of grounds here for a charter challenge on the way I was treated. And of course, we're going with a civil disobedience defense, because I realize what I am doing isn't because I'm making a mistake. It's not like I'm accidentally doing interviews with you, for example. I'm not accidentally sharing with the world what's going on in the schools to these kids and how this whole thing is playing out behind parents' backs. I'm very deliberately making people aware. Um, and so you can't argue behind a defense of I didn't know, or I didn't mean to do that, or I didn't know I had to use CD all the time, or I couldn't use a doctor's name, for example. And so you're left with civil disobedience. And in this case has all the hallmarks of being an excellent civil disobedience case, because everything that I'm talking about is of such importance to the public that the travesty is actually on the courts for silencing me from getting this kind of a story out to the public.
And the
So,
fact that really I'm, me and other, small, you know, people who are trying to educate are the ones who are putting out this story, but the major media is not touching it. And so you really don't have a lot of ways to get the information out about what's happening.
yeah, and I do correct people on that a little bit, because the major media has picked up on this story at times when it's relevant. The difference is, like, for example, right now between September 2 and November 30, it's about 90 days. Mainstream media isn't going to stay with the story for those 90 days, whereas you will, because this is something that it's important to you as someone who's getting a message out with your journalism or your podcast or whatever you call whatever. And but somebody like the CBC or the National Post have been involved in. I've had every major outlet in Canada cover this: CTV, Global News, CBC, the National Post, um, City TV, News 1130, CKNW. I mean, the list goes on, but they cover it in the moment, right? When there's a ruling or there's something of significance, they're all over it. But they're not going to cover stuff in the downtime, so to speak. And so I think that's what people confuse a little bit with, is that, well, we're hearing Rob doing interviews in the middle of, October, for example. Where's the mainstream on this? Well, because there's nothing that the mainstream is going to pick up on. I've dealt with the Federalist, for example, with Jeremiah Keenan, and he says too, their editors won't run stories unless there's something of significance in terms of like a court document or something that really anchors their story. And that's what mainstream media needs and picks up on. But in the meantime, the mainstream is going to come out and sort of say, I'm going to just interview the father in the middle of October for the fun of it, right? So no, the mainstream is there. And I've had interesting talks about the mainstream, because I really think they're paying attention. And I've said this, they just don't know how to get their hands in that cookie jar right now, because it used to be that they could get in on the other side. It was an easy one. We villainize the father, and we get on the side of calling him a transphobe, and we just really help the left out. But they've seen this story get taken over in such a way that doesn't work anymore, because I'm not being villainized. It's these people that are sterilizing kids, these doctors that are in hiding. I mean, you can't find them on the web anymore. I tried finding Justice Bowden in Missouri. You can't find pictures of them on the web anymore. And so I think what's happening is the mainstream media is kind of in this middle ground right now, where if they talk about it, but they go with what they've normally done, it's going to be really bad for them, right? It doesn't work anymore. If they suddenly go on my side of the story, then they're a bit uncomfortable with that, I think, at this point. They don't know, because there's a lot of political pressure in favor of this agenda. So they're nervous to do that. I think they're all watching very closely but they're just sort of sitting on the fence right now and just kind of waiting to see where are they going to eventually weigh in on this thing at some point in
Well,
a way that.
and the story ultimately is that doctors are sterilizing children. That's ultimately the story, that doctors, with the consent of the Canadian government and now the courts, are providing interventions for children that sterilize them. And ultimately, that's a hard story for the media to kind of get a handle on, because there's so many kind of these other complicating issues. And so I think that that's where you're speaking out is so important, that people need to know this is going on. And it's hard to get that message out there.
Right, and just to be clear, you're right about the Canadian government, but really the Infants Act is a provincial government.
Oh, okay.
To be honest, yes.
So that's just BC.
Yes, although lots of provinces have similar
Okay.
legislation as well. But you're absolutely right. The federal government can step in and do things for sure as well, and they're not helping. Trust me. I could get into some of that, but I think most people already know the government we have now is not on the side of helping me against sterilization of kids at this point. I mean, they're passing, all these crazy bills for to ban confirmation therapy and all these other. I mean, that's all fair. I mean, they're in on this too, right? The way things are going, and that's why I'm so glad. We have guys like Jen Smith working to get this national inquiry going, right? With top people in the Conservative Party. So and good on him. And we'll see if that gets tabled in the fall. It's as I'm being told it will be.
And so for those who don't know, Jen Smith has kind of been involved in this because at one point he interviewed you for his YouTube channel. And so he's sort of gotten pulled in. Laura-Lynn, I'm not sure, Laura-Lynn Thomas Taylor, is that her?
Oh, yeah. Laura-Lynn Tyler Thomas.
She interviewed you, so she's sort of involved. I've interviewed you. Other people have interviewed you and sort of have gotten involved in this. But Jen Smith is, and I believe Laura-Lynn is they're trying to call for a national inquiry about what's happening at these hospitals where they're treating gender dysphoric children, sometimes even children who wouldn't even qualify as gender dysphoric, with treatments that are ultimately going to sterilize them. And so there's been this call in Canada for a national inquiry. I'm hoping that here in the US we'll have a similar call at some point. But it's really hard to get the message out about what's going on, because typically when I try to tell people about it, they say, oh, that's not really happening. They don't do that to kids. And yet your case is an example that actually, yes, they do. And as young as 14 years old, they're doing this to children.
Oh, even younger.
Yeah.
Younger. My daughter was messed up in this stuff since like grade 5 or 6.
And I've heard of 8-year-olds. 8-year-olds under a National Institute of Health study here in the US are getting cross-sex hormones, not just puberty blockers, but also cross-sex hormones. So this is really happening. Children really are getting sterilized. And so knowing that you're potentially facing jail, what is it that motivates you? Go ahead.
Well, and keep in mind, like when I talk about sterilization, I mean, that's maybe the worst part of it, but everything is irreversible. I mean, osteoporosis, bone density, facial hair for
Heart
girls,
disease.
And they got all these different diseases like heart disease, because it stunts your puberty at the moment you start doing this stuff, and you don't develop. I mean, we can talk about the way the genitals don't ever develop.
Right, they never develop.
So sterilization is obviously the scariest of the one, I think, of it all. But I mean, these are the other things that kids are saying, hey, I'm accepting these risks. And they're just guinea pigs. I mean, this is an experiment on so many levels. And yet the one thing we do know is it does sterilize kids. And these things we do know as well, that, if you detransition and you've been on testosterone, well, you're still shaving the rest of your life. You don't, there's a bit of a myth that you can just start taking estrogen and maybe that helps, but it doesn't get rid of these consequences that the testosterone has already done to you.
Right. The voice is always lower. A lot of times these girls and young women develop male pattern baldness. Their genitals never develop, and oftentimes, if the cross-sex hormones are paired with puberty blockers, then their organs never developed. So going off of the testosterone really doesn't help, because there's already been damage to the reproductive system. So some people say, well, it's not a big deal if they can just detransition if they decide to later in life. But these are long-term consequences. They're not reversible. And they're also at a huge risk for their health, because a female body is not meant to have those high levels of testosterone, and a male body is not built to have high levels of estrogen. And so I've heard with males who are taking estrogen at a young age, their chances of breast cancer goes way up, and heart disease and other things. So these are treatments that induce severe consequences, life-threatening, oftentimes, side effects. And for a government to approve of a child deciding to use them is just confounding to me.
Yeah. So of course, because I've been speaking on this, and this is getting back to you're talking about different kinds of sentencing, is I was under the impression that I was facing 45 days in jail, but I've now been told that it's actually 5 years.
Wow.
So, which is,
That's a long
I
time.
would say that those are close.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant difference. I
That's a
mean,
bit of a difference. And, it doesn't change what I'm doing. I mean, it is what it is. Uh, and of course, I mean, it's a bit too late anyways. I can't turn back the time. I can't do what Superman did at the end of the Superman, the movie, and raise Lois Lane from the dead, essentially, like he
would
did.
you,
Does.
if you knew that you were going to potentially be spending 5 years in prison, way back when you first did the interview with me, would you still have done it?
I would have, actually, because I still think this is just too important. And I hope people understand that it's too late for my child, but I believe that it's so, children are so precious. They're our future. As not just parents, but as a society, we are called on to protect them. That's one of our number one responsibilities. They say if it takes a village to raise a child, they're not just saying it just the parents, they're saying everybody in that village. It's your responsibility. And in raising a child, that means it's our responsibility to protect them. And when you have a government that is going out there in what I call state-sponsored child abuse, and people are turning a blind eye, we're not living up to our responsibility as a society anymore on this matter, I believe. And I understand that governments and different things can be a scary adversary, I suppose. But you know what? I mean, I'm doing it. I'm not alone. There's others doing it. There are people that stand with me shoulder to shoulder that maybe don't necessarily have children directly going through this, but then again, they're taking on that responsibility as being part of that village, right? Like Jen Smith, my understanding is he doesn't have children, but yet he's shoulder to shoulder with me because he believes what they're doing to children is wrong, for example. And then you're going to have parents like Angelina Ireland, who has a daughter, but is obviously not going through any of this stuff. But again, has that sense that we have to protect, because this could be her child, for example, right? And so it takes all types and all religions too. Like this isn't, to me, a religious thing in the sense that it doesn't involve everybody. I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. the other day, because of course he is an example of civil disobedience in the civil rights movement. But how does his name start? It's the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., right? And yet I don't think that stopped anybody who wasn't a Christian who believed in the civil rights movement from standing shoulder to shoulder with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It was not something to be ashamed of. In fact, it was something he was quite, I think, proud of, was to use, the scriptures and his faith in God to help in his civil disobedience, right? There was a power in it. That was partly what defined why he did it and what made him, I believe.
Well, and you're in very good company with civil disobedience, because Jesus Christ is probably one of the best known example of civil disobedience. He chose to speak out truth rather than be silenced by those around him who wanted him quiet.
Yeah, I mean, he walked into the temple and threw out all these people that were making a profit in there and said, "This is my father's house. How dare you come in here and do what you're doing and defiling this place?" And these are powerful people. I mean, in Israel, the Pharisees and Sadducees were at the top of the order in terms of power, right? I mean, ultimately, they were the ones that arrested Jesus and then handed him over to, at that time, Pontius Pilate, who now they're handing him over to Rome, the state. And even Pontius Pilate wanted nothing to do with it at the time. But he just realized if he was in control, in order to keep these Pharisees and these powerful officials in Israel aligned with him without causing, riots and all this other stuff, he sort of went along with it and said, well, I'm going to do this, but he washed his hands of it as well.
And
Of
Jesus
course, but
paid
yeah.
the ultimate sacrifice. I don't think that you'll have to. I don't think that you'll die for this. You're not facing the death
No,
penalty
no.
for speaking out. But I'm wondering, do you gain some degree of comfort from looking to Jesus as an example?
Yeah, and you know what? And I know I even made a request to get into a little bit of this stuff, because there's some interesting things I think going on in the world right now. I think people, when they see what's going on in a case like this, they're wondering, like when things are good, people tend to kind of not be as compelled to worry about faith issues as much. I think that's just a bit of human nature. But when you live in a world now where people are seeing, for example, the Black Lives Matter stuff that goes on, the riots, and people are like, what's going on here? They're looking at what's going on with the coronavirus, and people are on two different sides with that. Some are saying this is the worst pandemic since the Black Plague, and we need to handle it in every way possible. And then you have the other side where people are saying that they feel like they're watching their democracies become police states, and then you get into the issues of what's happening in the schools. You have children being yanked out by school officials on lunch break to have abortions. They're getting yanked out to have testosterone shots. They're being sterilized. You have these issues on euthanasia now, the right to die, where I believe elderly people are in some ways being told you're a burden to society. How do we sort of get rid of you? And there's just a lot of stuff that I think people are taking in, and that's probably just the tip of some of the iceberg of some of the issues going on in the world today. And I think people are saying, wow, it's like hell is at my doorstep. So where is God? And I think people are looking for a God right now, because I think people need one in a way now than that maybe they haven't felt they've needed a God in some time. And some very interesting things even happened in this court case, because I was one of those people that was sort of like, well, I don't know. Do I need a God? Is God real? And I remember the first time at the Bowden hearing when I met Barbara Finley, who is the sex activist lesbian lawyer for my daughter. I felt a cold chill go down my back, and I knew that I had just come into contact with a devil or a demon. It just felt that way, and you know it when you kind of feel it. And I remember thinking at that time, wow, if there's a devil, there's a God. And that's kind of what pushed me back into believing, is that you can't have one without the other. There's no way there are just demons. And another interesting thing is that my understanding, and I'm not a theologian or a pastor, but is that when the Holy Spirit is present, demons have to tell the truth. I've kind of heard that. Maybe I'm a bit wrong, because some interesting things came up. And this was in the Mazzari ruling. And lawyers, again, for my daughter and stuff, when they were trying to get that protection order on me, which was that one where if I could be arrested immediately by the RCMP, they pointed to me in the gallery and they said, Justice Mazzari, this man behind me here, he is going to be the single biggest threat to the trans agenda in the world. And I remember looking at her going, are you crazy, lady? Like, I'm just here trying to get my daughter off cross-sex hormones. But it was almost like they knew something that I didn't even know myself yet. And of course, here we are, right? I
Wow.
mean, guys
I
like
just got
myself and
chills just hearing that, Rob.
yeah, it's crazy, right? I was like foreshadowing, because that's kind of where we are right now, right? And not just me, but I just mean they were pointing to me. I mean, there's others. I mean, there's Jeff Younger and there's lots of people working on it. But to have them make a statement like that at a time when I didn't even clue into the significance of it then. And of course, now I see it now, and I'm in it again. And even in the Court of Appeal, and I've mentioned this several times, is lawyers, again, for my child and the rest of them, insisted that having a Bible in my home was family violence. Like, they actually had the audacity to bring that up in the Court of Appeal. Yeah.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. They brought up the fact that I should not be allowed to have a Bible in my home because that was an act of family violence against my daughter.
A lot of
And
people need to hear this, Rob, because that's huge. If they're trying to impinge on religious freedoms to that extent that it's considered violence to have a Bible in your home, that to me is just horrifying.
they requested it. They didn't get it.
Right.
But they actually,
the fact that they would even insinuate that your religious beliefs were somehow violence against others, and that's where I see this going. I mean, the UN is even pushing this idea that that our religious freedoms should be curtailed if they don't support the trans agenda. And so it's not just in Canada. The UN is pushing this as well, and it's shocking.
It is. I know I had mentioned that in some other interviews, but it's probably something I should mention more often, because it is really important for not just Christians, but people of any faith back to realize, that this is where they're going. And as you've alluded to, and others, the government of BC, for example, has said that, we need to protect children from their parents, as an example, right? And from possibly their religions. And, I have heard people on that side say that one of the goals is to get rid of Christianity because it gets in the way of their agenda, as an example. We have the case where Lori Thronis and others, which are MLAs here in the provincial government, who have been thrown under the bus because they actually put an ad into a magazine called The Light magazine, which is a mainstream Christian magazine. And the leader of the party came back and said, Wilkinson came back and apologized and said, well, yeah, we shouldn't be advertising in a Christian magazine because these magazines are hate literature.
Oh, wow. And what people don't realize is that first they come for Christians, and then they're going to come for Muslims, and then they're going to come for you. I mean, that's the thing, is that you might think, oh, I don't really care about Christians. But what's happening here isn't about Christians specifically. It's about a government curtailing parental rights, and then religious freedoms, and then freedoms of speech, and gradually just eroding away at personal freedoms to the point at which they're going to charge you with hate speech if you say something that they disagree with. And that's going to affect everybody.
It certainly will. And that's why there's so many shocking things going on, even with this court case that is bringing things out into the open. And, people will ask me, like, how or why or do you do this in spite of facing possibly now 5 years in prison? And the answer is quite simple, is if there's one thing in the Bible, and I believe it's universal, I don't think it's just a scriptural thing, but definitely you see this in scripture, is how important children were to Jesus Christ and to God, right? It's there all the way through. They even mention to get into heaven, you have to have faith like a child, for example, and bring the little children unto me. And if there's one thing that I think angers, and this is why with this case, I've also been very good and very deliberate in keeping it under that umbrella of this is what's happening to children. I don't get into what adults want to do. That's their business. They can read the Bible and make up their own mind, or they can read their own literature. I can read their stuff. They can decide that. But universally, just like what Christ does in Scripture, we have, and I know I touched on this already to some degree in terms of how precious children are, but there's something that should unite us, and that is protecting children. And if it makes you and I angry, and others, and obviously, I mean, Kerry Lynn is an atheist. He's angry about this. So it's we have feminists. I mean, the group goes on and on. This is, maybe Christians are a big part of this fight, and they should be, but I think everybody should be upset about what's happening to children, regardless of your background, so to speak, unless you're an activist, and then I don't know. That's a whole different group of people. And but generally speaking, and so I go on because I know if we're this angry, imagine how angry God is right now. And I'll tell you, I'd rather have him on my side than Barbara Finley. So I don't have anything to worry about because I'm on the team that cannot lose. It's already preordained that Christ wins this whole battle, right? And so why would I not be on that team? Why would I be afraid? Why would I not move forward, right? I mean, we've got the Holy Spirit. He gives it to us. We can use it. And I'm so impressed because I talk to a lot of people now, and I sense from what I'm hearing, there's a revival in the church. People are feeling like there's a real importance in connecting with their faith again. And I think the Holy Spirit, because it's being called upon in ways that hasn't been before, I think for a lot of people, it's almost palpable to feel it now. Whereas when you're in the good times, you're not really asking for that kind of help. And so you don't feel it, and you kind of think, well, this is just, but, and we've gotten so much into science, whereas you go back into the Middle Ages and there's always this cycle where people all of a sudden kind of get back into the more spiritual aspects of life, and then we kind of cycle back into science. And I think we're really headed on a spiritual revival here for a lot of people, I think, because of what's going on in the world. And I think people feel that presence now. And God is here because he's angry. He doesn't like any of the stuff that's going on. And he will protect all of us, maybe not in the ways we want. He may have to protect me in prison for 5 years, but that's important to me. I mean, this is still work that needs to be done. We need to protect children. We're called to do that regardless of our religious background. I believe anyways, we're called to do that just as parents. And like I said, as members of a village to raise children, and it takes all types. But no, I have no embarrassment about saying that I'm a Christian, not any more than I think Carrie Lynn is embarrassed to say he's an atheist. I mean,
Well, and
it
in a
doesn't
way,
bother.
that's what makes your team really powerful, is that nobody can kind of put you in a box and dismiss you because you're a Christian and Carrie's an atheist. And you have people like Jen Smith, who's an atheist, I believe, and people like Laura-Lynn, who's Christian. So yeah, we're
Yeah.
not sure about Jen Smith.
I would still put him in
But
the
you have
agnostic
these
box.
people from all these different perspectives coming together and supporting each other. And I think that really strengthens you in a way, because it shows that this isn't just a Christian issue. This is an issue that's going to affect all of us.
It sure will. And it is. I mean,
It is.
it's affecting so many people now, either directly or indirectly. How many people are afraid now to put their kids in public schools after hearing what's going on? I mean, it's affecting so many people who are like, I didn't realize when I was sending my kid off to school that I wasn't sending them there to learn math and science and English. I'm sending them there to be indoctrinated, right?
And that is
So,
not like hyperbole. That really is happening. These kids really are being indoctrinated when they go to school. And more I'm hearing people call to homeschool kids. And the fact that that people are afraid to send their kids to school because they're afraid of this kind of indoctrination is, it just suggests that we've moved far beyond any reasonable boundaries of what's happening in schools. That parents are afraid of their teachers undermining parents, and now you have to worry about doctors potentially giving a child these really damaging drugs without parents even knowing that they're getting it.
that's scary. It's scary stuff.
So
It's not scary.
you're feeling prepared to sort of keep speaking out, keep showing that civil disobedience in order to protect kids.
I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing under the banner of civil disobedience. I'm not going to flaunt the court rulings by calling out doctors anymore by name. I don't need to anyways, I don't think at this point. And I'm going to stay within certain boundaries. But having said that, the message is what needs to come out. And if I can tell my story, and in fact, this story has evolved into so many different things. I mean, I'm talking about freedom of speech issues. I'm talking about corruption at the highest levels that I think is going on in government and courts that are coming out now because this case has gone on so much longer, I think, than any of these people that are trying to cover things up thought it would. That should have all been buried in that little hidden file and never have come to light, and it's slowly trickling out, this information. And just people have to be aware. I mean, we need a complete, some kind of accountability has to be start happening. If this is really truly a democracy, um, then let's keep it a democracy. Otherwise, this is no longer, then we're heading down a socialist, fascist, possibly Marxist pathway, right? Which a lot of people believe is what is happening. And I don't deny that they're probably right in suggesting that.
And so as we finish up here, I want to encourage people to go to your GoFundMe or your, I'm not sure what kind of, you have a fundraiser, because you have legal expenses and you also have expenses potentially, if you go to jail, you're going to need funds to keep paying child support, to, you know, to keep things going. So I'm going to post a link to your fundraiser.
Because there's two fundraising pages that we're running concurrently. That's the idea. And one of them is for the main stuff that you said. It was, this one dates back quite some time now. And it was really about, you know, me missing, say, time at work or possibly being in jail. And you're right, the fact that through this whole court case, I've now lost my kids in the courts I've awarded pretty much, yeah. And so there's a lot of reasons for that funding page. And that's really to keep me from living in my Jeep and being able to continue to do what I'm doing. The one that we're starting is going to be specific because my understanding from Laura-Lynn is that if we can get up to even $8,000, we'll have plenty of money for him to be able to run a full and adequate defense of freedom of speech, all these different things, my civil disobedience. And I hope people keep in mind that just because I'm the one sitting in possibly the prisoner's docket, these are your freedoms of speech that are under attack. This is for all people now. This is not even me protecting my own daughter. This is me protecting, working to save other children, working to save your freedom of speech, working to make sure that you can have these conversations around the dinner table and not have some Gestapo people suddenly knock down your door and say, well, you can't be talking about this stuff. So this is for everybody. And what happens here is going to affect everybody in Canada. And what happens, we often say what happens in the States affects Canada, but I believe what happens in any democracy affects other democracies. I think what's going to happen here will have an effect on the United States, will have an effect on European countries. I believe it will to some degree.
Yeah, I think that the outcome of this case is going to be really important. And just so people know, Laura-Lynn is doing the case pro bono, but there are all these sort of extraneous expenses that he incurs trying to do the research and, you know, hiring experts and all that. And that's where the money will go. So I'll post links to both of those in the description of this video. And is there anything else that you wanted to touch upon before we end up here?
No, you know, I'm just grateful for all the people that are supporting. Like, even as you mentioned, mine is the Go Get Funding page, the one that's being set up for the legal stuff that Laura-Lynn feels he needs in terms of resources is going to be a GoFundMe page. So they're actually sound very similar, but they're two different complete website companies, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, no, I'm so grateful for all the support people have given. I'm grateful to see this sort of this revival in people's, you know, in terms of their faith and in terms of different things. I mean, it's just awesome stuff to see what's going on, how we're coming together, because I believe we are coming together as a community. And I believe that, I firmly believe this isn't something we're losing anymore. This is something we're pushing back on. We're making headway. We're not putting our finger in the dike, as they say in Holland, to keep the water out anymore. We're not only repairing the dike, we're reclaiming land. And it's awesome stuff to see, and I just appreciate everybody's work. I know there's a lot of people that they never get recognized for what they do behind the scenes, but there's a lot of people working hard. There's people that simply donate money. That's awesome. I mean, that's the contribution to all this. There's people that do letter writing. There's people that, you know, will phone their own personal MLAs, and I won't even know that they've done that. And then I'll get a message, you know, a month later and say, yeah, I reached out to my MLA and I shared your story because I didn't want that happening to my kid. And they're unsung heroes, but all of these people are heroes. And you know, just because there's people like myself and others that happen to be in the spotlight, I mean, that's necessary for this to move forward, but that's not the whole picture by any stretch of the imagination. There's so much that goes on I posted something the other day, and I was talking about how at the end of the Lord of the Rings, and I was mentioning this with Jeff Younger, and I said you have these two characters, Frodo and Samwise, and they go up, and of course it ends up being Gollum who bites his finger off to take the ring into Mount Doom. But without all these other people who had assembled at the gates of Mordor, all these armies of men and elves and everything else that's in this book, Frodo and Sam would never have made it to Mount Doom, because it was all these people that, with all the work that they did, that distracted the eye of Sauron and was able to let these two little Hobbit characters sneak in underneath and ultimately have that ring destroyed. And in fact, it's an interesting story again, because it again shows the infallibility, or the fallibility, because Frodo didn't even want to destroy the ring. It was because Gollum bit his finger off that the ring ended up being destroyed. So again, I mean, even characters, and you can point out that even seem like they're heroic, have so many flaws, and you know, and I'm one of them, and you know, we're all doing things, but my point is that it all works together, and when one piece is missing, you can tell that there's a piece missing. And
we
so
do
that's why I'm
need
so grateful.
people who are willing to write letters, to contact their legislators, to you know, just to do even just a small bit, even just to tell their neighbors, even just to talk about your story, even just to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. I mean, I think we're to a point where the more people find out what's happening, the more they're willing to. It's just that most people really didn't understand what was happening before. And so we really need to get people to, you know, get people the information, because I think once people realize what's happening, they're going to be right there in the army next to you, Rob.
And you know what's been a wonderful thing to watch is when I started in this, and of course I know people that have been in this a lot longer than I, but you had to be very careful what you said, who you said things to, for example, or you would get shunned. You know, like I started saying, well, these people are perverts, and you just can't do that. It's not nice. You're gonna get in trouble for it. And people didn't really want to talk about this stuff. And now it's, you know, like you said, Derek Sloan with the National Enquiry with Jen Smith. We've normalized this conversation, right? We're talking about it publicly, openly. Politicians are talking about it, and that's a big step forward from where things were. And
so maybe Barbara Finlayson was right that you are going to be the biggest threat to transgender rights, just because you're willing to speak out and talk about what's going on rather than being bullied into silence.
Well, I'm a bit more humble than that, but I thought it was interesting that she brought that up at that time.
And it may not be you, but it's sort of what's happening because of you, you know, sort of that ripple that you've formed. You know, you threw the stone in the pond and started the ripple, and now it's starting to go out and hit lots of different places. And so I'm really grateful that you've been willing to stand up and say, hey, this isn't okay, and I'm going to risk going to jail because I know how important it is to protect children.
Very important. That, I think, is one of our most important callings.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. And I look forward to talking to you again over the next couple of months to see how this case progresses.
Yeah, no, definitely we'll be in touch as this case continues. So, and
thanks so much.
Yeah, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think we've just about covered everything.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off.
Okay.